Ok, velkommen til enda en lockdown-episode av Skravleklassen. Jeg er veldig gira igjen. Jeg har med meg en person som jeg er veldig opptatt av om dagen, som jeg synes gjør utrolig mye bra. Jeg skal ikke bruke så lang tid på å introdusere han. Han heter David Fuller, tidligere BBC Channel 4-journalist i England, som også har laget en rekke filmer om blant annet Syria, independent-filmer, og nå driver en YouTube-kanal som heter Rebel Wisdom, hvis hovedoppgave er å, ifølge han selv, prøve å hjelpe folk å manøvrere i en stadig mer forvirrende mediehverdag, mer kompleks, hvor desinformasjon er en veldig, veldig stor del av økosystemet, og fake news, konspirasjonsteorier, ulike typer agendaer som han prøver gjøre et nobelt forsøk på å prøve å, om ikke avdekkes, i hvert fall hjelpe oss å manøvrere rundt og i. So I'm just going to throw the ball to you. Very basic question, as we both know, worked as journalists. Who is David Fuller and what is your background?
Takk skal du ha.
That's very funny. Can you say brown cheese in Norwegian?
Brown cheese in Norwegian.
You know, we have this concept in Norwegian media called Norway friendly or Norwegian friend. That's like a person, usually from the US or the UK, famous person who's always been like friendly to Norway, like Dolly Parton, John Cleese, and I don't remember wrongly, I think Deep Purple, maybe.
Right.
Strange concept. Are you one of those?
I don't think I've ever been. I've been to Sweden a lot, but not to Norway.
You know the term Swedish. How do you say it in English? Swedish tendencies or Swedish, like the you know which term I'm referring to?
No, I don't.
Svenske tilstander. No, it's a very specific Scandinavian word or a phrase. My mind is blanking as regards to the translation, but it's translated loosely to how things are going in Sweden. And we used to say that about America, like things are crazy over there. But now we say like it's Swedish tendencies. It means like violence is everywhere and people are crazy and political.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think actually Dave Rubin, which you obviously know who is, he has talked about the Swedish thing. So it's a bit sad because we used to be two parallel democracies, which we still are, of course, but the rate of violence and stuff like that has just skyrocketed in Sweden. And now we also see the pandemic, COVID deaths and stuff like that. So it's a bit, because they've always been our big brother, like with better music and better movies and better everything, and now it's just crazy over there. But that's not what we're going to talk about. Back to the question. David Fuller, who are you and what's your background?
So I'm a journalist and filmmaker I live in London. I used to work for Channel 4 News for many years. And also I've made documentaries for the BBC, for Channel 4, for Al Jazeera, many other places. And about 3 years ago, I started up a media channel of my own called Rebel Wisdom. And that channel initially was based on, or it started with an interview that I did with Jordan Peterson. And after that did pretty well, I then made a documentary about the sort of famous interview that Jordan Peterson did with Kathy Newman that was called A Glitch in the Matrix. And that's now got about 5 million views, something like that. So that's done pretty well. And then the Rebel Wisdom, the channel, I've kind of since that time, since making the film about Jordan Peterson, I followed sort of the thread of philosophy and culture that I found interesting. So I did a few films about sort of various people within what's called the intellectual dark web. And then also a kind of a new group of people connected to something called Game B. And yeah, I've basically made films about the topics that I'm interested in, and around 200,000 other people are interested enough in them to have subscribed to Rebel Wisdom. So I think that's kind of...
I want to go... Yeah, thanks. I want to go very specifically and talk about your shift in regards to your view on mainstream media and why you left and everything like that. First, I just want to ask you a question about my own travel or journey inside like this new media paradigm, and that you're a big contributor. I'm a mere spectator, but my way into it was also through the intellectual dark web. I wrote a bit about Jordan Peterson for Norwegian newspapers, and a bit about the concept as a whole, as Barry Weiss described in her piece. But I feel I have had an evolution, and that you talked about some people loosely affiliated with something called Game B, and that's actually why I really picked up on your channel, because I felt kind of claustrophobic inside, or it's kind of a rabbit hole feeling regards to this loosely connected group called intellectual dark web. And I don't want to sound silly, but when I first heard about Game B and Schmachtenberger and all those people I want to talk a lot about, I felt like it opened my eyes somewhat. I felt like, as I wrote to you, I finally found a home in a very, very disturbing new media sphere, which I also worked a bit in myself. Can you understand that journey? Do you?
Yeah. I mean, do
you feel some of the same?
I mean, I feel like I've been critical of the... Oh, shite. Oh. Might have to cut that bit out. That was the...
It's Rebel Wisdom bloopers.
Yeah, that was the... what do you call it?
Glitch in the Matrix.
Yeah, the glitch in the Matrix. That was the auto cue. Just fell down, so I've just put it back up again. So yeah, I think the intellectual dark web was the naming of a really important sort of heterodokse movement, kind of in contrast. And it was basically, I think, the naming of an alternative sense-making, journalistic sort of, but so let's call it a sense-making system that was separate from the mainstream media. So Jordan Peterson was in it, Brett Weinstein, Sam Harris, and it was a kind of, it wasn't an official thing, but it was the naming of, Joe Rogan, clearly sort of one of the most popular podcasters, Dave Rubin, and it was the sort of grouping together of a lot of these really people who'd made a success of independent media. And so it really highlighted that there was an alternative thing to the mainstream. And the question of what that was a really interesting one. Whether that was entirely reactionary to the mainstream media or not was one that I was really interested in. And I've been critical of the intellectual dark web for not really, because they styled themselves as having the conversations that were not in the mainstream. And I think they did address a lot of topics that the sort of the naive liberal mainstream had sort of said, this is settled, we're not going to discuss this anymore. Topics around gender, for example. And they did so in a really interesting way. But I don't think it pushed on. I think it had the potential to become a more inclusive or a movement that included more perspectives, and I don't think it did. And whereas I look at the other people that I've featured on Rebel Wisdom since, and you mentioned Daniel Schmachtenberger, I'd say sort of Jamie Wheel, people like that, they, I think, have a more nuanced view than the intellectual dark web did. And one of the key, this may be too much detail for people who are not completely familiar with the terms, but a really important piece to make sense of what's going on, I think, is the integral theory, Ken Wilbur, and a sort of developmental lens, because it then is able to explain why certain worldviews are existing, why they're in conflict with each other, and where might be a kind of synthesis between them. And I featured that quite a lot.
So I wouldn't be able to explain Ken Wilbur's ideas myself, but I hope we can touch upon them. But just to track back a little bit before we get into the world of sense making and signal and noise and all those concepts that really got me hooked on your channel, and especially as you mentioned Schmachtenberger, which can be viewed upon as one of the protagonists now of your channel. Well deserved. But let's start with your journey into this. You worked in the BBC and in Channel 4, which aired the infamous interview with Cathy Newman and Jordan Peterson, which you also made a video about, and also a documentary. Can you pinpoint when and what happened when you realized that you were part of something disingenuous as a part of the mainstream media in the UK, or was it a long, drawn-out process?
I wouldn't call it disingenuous. I mean, I was always frustrated by the narrowness of the perspective within the media. I'm someone who, I studied philosophy. I'm kind of very aware, and I think more and more people are becoming aware that there's something quite fundamentally dysfunctional about the current system. And that's quite a complex picture to unpack, with the sense that that we need some kind of a deeper shift, and that there's a way of being in the world that's coming to an end. And I'd say that the mainstream or traditional media is very much part of that. Like there are certain perspectives that are that you're able to put onto the television. There's certain perspectives that you're not. The thing that really interested me about Jordan Peterson was that I've been very aware of the kind of new atheist secular bias of the traditional media or the mainstream media, and Jordan Peterson was taking that on quite directly. He was talking about the reality of religious experience and the value of the mythopoetic, and talking about stuff like Jung and these figures that are beyond the mainstream culture. And that's what I thought was incredibly interesting about him. And I've made a lot of other films about topics that I think the mainstream liberal media doesn't cover very well. Topics like gender being one of them, which was the subject of the interview between Jordan Peterson and Cathy Newman. I'm 50-50. I'm as concerned about the decline of our sense-making institutions, the mainstream media. Like, I'm not one of those people who just thinks that the mainstream media is completely corrupt and needs to be replaced, and I see that a lot on places like YouTube. There's an incredible amount of anger and rage at the mainstream media, and I think that's too much. It's actually throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think we need functioning mainstream organs. I think it's true if you look at something like the New York Times, that's become very ideologically captured, and increasingly so over the last few years. There's a certain sort of quite naive left perspective, which some people call wokeness, which I think has started taking over a lot of left-wing or even more centrist institutions. And that's a problem, not because I think that perspective is really valuable, but when it becomes the only perspective that's allowed, that becomes a real problem. And that, I think, has changed increasingly since I was working in the media. But I'm more interested in, like, how can we expand the amount of how can we expand the Overton window, or how can we expand the number of perspectives that we have in these mainstream organs?
Because when you say expand,
fundamentally, I think I worry that we don't have anything to replace it with. The problems of truth, the problems of sense making in the digital world and the alternative world are at least as bad, and I would say probably far worse than they are in the mainstream world. At least most papers, at least most TV stations have some kind of fact checking. They have some journalistic obligation to, if you make some kind of a claim, to at least find out what the other side of that claim is and try and put that into your piece of journalism. Like that, what I'm really concerned about is this sense that we're losing a lot of those guardrails, and I'm as concerned about that as I am about the flaws in the mainstream.
But it's obvious that the lack of trust in the big institutions, for instance, the media institutions, and also as the Weinstein brothers is pointing towards a lot of the time against the big academic institutions. Is that warranted, do you think? Should we be suspicious of what Eric Weinstein would call the gated institutional narrative? Should we be suspicious of the biggest newspapers, the big channels, and the big universities, or is this a symptom of something else, something in the psyche of the world of today?
I think we should. I think we should be concerned. I mean, Eric and Brett Weinstein are very interesting thinkers. I think they go too far with their critique. I think they're essentially right with, so they said, I think it was on the Rubin report in their conversation, they talked about how truth-seeking cannot withstand an encounter with market forces. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, whether that's academia or journalism. I think there is quite a deep rot in our truth-seeking institutions that goes pretty deep. And I've done pieces about like the corruptions, for example, that big pharmaceutical companies and their domination of the discussion around mental health, for example, I think has been incredibly damaging, and quite, that's a massive story in America in particular. But it is quite complex. The danger with that perspective, and I think Brett and Eric do veer towards it sometimes, is that you can become too conspiratorial. I think like at one end of the scale, yes, I think we should be cautious, or we should recognize the corrupting influence of profit, the corrupting influence of sort of aligned incentives in many of the different industries that we have. But at the other side, you end up with something a little bit like QAnon, which is the entire thing is corrupt and needs to be torn down. And I think it's very difficult. I don't see many people able to hold that nuance. Like, people either seem to take refuge in complete acceptance or complete buying into the sort of mainstream narrative, or if they start to kind of question it, they sort of start to drift towards, like recently with Brett and Eric, and there was a major rift within the intellectual dark web quite recently, because Sam Harris basically called out and criticized a lot of his sort of former allies in his last podcast, and said he thinks that they've lost the plot, thinks they're bonkers, because a lot of them were basically promoting some of the conspiracy theories after the election, saying that Trump might have won the election, there might have been huge voting fraud, and both Brett and to some degree Eric, but certainly Brett, was sort of saying, oh, we need to make sure we check this out. Majid Nawaz, who is another member of the intellectual dark web, was also promoting sort of effectively nonsense. Like, no one has really pointed to any truth behind these narratives of fraud. But if you start questioning all the mainstream, if you start questioning every single mainstream outlet, you can fall far too far down the other side.
So that's a perfect bridge into what I really want to talk about, the kind of new movement, which maybe doesn't have a name yet, but for me, from my perspective, it seems like you are in the vanguard of pushing these new ultra nuanced ideas, or I think it's another term I can't remember right here and now, but super nuanced, or do you remember which term I'm referring to? Hypernyansering or hyper, yeah, you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
To go in deeper into the nuances of things, to try to find a third way, because it seems to me like you also agree with that after the reaction against the you can say the super politically correct climate didn't start 10 years ago, but we started to react against it 10 years ago, and the pendulum has swung very, very fast in the other direction. One example for me is like Dave Rubin, which seems to have just gone full-blown right-wing pandering with his base audience, almost like not a mini Trump, but it's the same logic with like talking to his base, and it became an echo chamber. So there are these new people with you, and you mentioned Schmachtenberger, who are seeking to find a new way to orient yourselves and us in these very, very strange times and complex narrative warfare-ish environment. Can you try to explain how you stumbled upon these people and what attracted you to them and who they are?
Yeah, I'm always looking for who are the people who can hold that complexity of recognizing that there is something dysfunctional about some parts of the left, but not giving over to that narrative completely. Like Dave Rubin being a perfect example. Jordan Peterson even, I like a lot of his work, but I also think that he was quite reactive about the radical left. And so who are the people who have this, what Ken Wilbur would, I guess, call sort of more integral perspective? So they're able to hold complexity. They're not just pushing one particular narrative. And so Schmachtenberger and Jamie Wheel would be people that I put in that category. Recently, I've just done an interview with John Wood Jr., who is a Black conservative from California. Really interesting guy. And we had a sort of long conversation about what comes next in this sort of heterodokse space. So the kind of non-mainstream perspectives. Someone I also really rate is Aisha Akanbi, who I've had on the channel a couple of times. So she's from the UK. Someone like Chloe Valdery, also I really rate. I really like her stuff. She seems to have that sort of flexibility. Whereas I see a lot of the people in the original intellectual dark web constellation becoming more and more sort of reactive and more polarized and polarizing in their perspectives. Rubin being the perfect example. I mean, Dave Rubin right now, if you watch, there's a Twitter account called Dave Rubin Clips, where someone is just going through and clipping up some of his most latest stuff. And what he's saying is indistinguishable from QAnon now. He's basically saying exactly the same as the conspiracy theory QAnon, which basically says that Trump is the savior and there's this sort of deep state cabal that are in control of everything. And Rubin basically is saying watered down versions of the same thing. Like, he's not accepting the election result. He says that there's something, trust the plan, something's going to happen. Trump and Trump's lawyers have got something up their sleeve, and he's going to come back and he's going to win. And it's really, it's quite sad to see in a way.
One of my other new heroes is a programmer, kind of mathematic philosopher, AI kind of guy, Joshua Bach. I don't know if you heard about him, and he talks about the regards to the culture wars, which I think Dave Rubin and others are a perfect example of people who are really addicted to it, kind of. And he says that everything that is beautiful is elsewhere. Just move away from it. But of course, we cannot do that completely, because so much of the problems we are bogged down in is linked to this so-called culture war. But I feel like a guy like Schmachtenberger and the Game B people, they're really trying to find solutions and not just get bogged down in semantics and shit throwing and team blue versus team red and who said that and who said this and who got canceled. And it seems so uninteresting to me right now. So let's move over to what is more interesting, what your project is much about now. And it seems also to me that it's almost a new vocabulary coming together with these new ideas that you're propagating. Let's start with one of the main themes that you're talking a lot about, the word sense making. Why is it so important, and why what does it mean? Why is it so important, and why are we so very bad at it at the current moment?
Yeah, I mean, we use the word sense making a lot because it seems to summarize more than just it points to the fact that it's not just the information that's the problem. We are kind of overwhelmed with information. It also shows that our way of perceiving is part of that. And it points to the fact that social media in particular has created these filter bubbles around ourselves. What we have is a kind of, this is quite technical language, but some people have called it the fracturing of the epistemic commons, which means the way that we make sense of the world. So epistemology is the study of how we come to know what we know. So even the way that we come to know what we know has been challenged by particularly social media, basically fragmenting us into smaller and smaller groups, and also making what I perceive as reality completely different from what someone else might perceive as reality. And these are sort of basic human biases. We want to see stuff that agrees with what we already think. We're persuaded to, we don't like being wrong. We don't like challenging ourselves. All of those things are part of sense making. So it's the reason for that word is that it encompasses that whole area. It's not just the information that we're taking in. It's also about the emotional state that I might be in while I'm taking in that information. It's about how do I make sense of the world when social media is trying to deliberately provoke me in many ways. That social media is, as one of our interviewees, Tristan Harris, said, there's a race to the bottom of the brainstem. So it wants to create what they call limbic hijack. It wants to create overwhelm. It wants to create an emotional reaction because that keeps you more addicted to using whatever platform it is. And it's not necessarily that anyone needs to have that as a kind of secret plan. That's the incentive structure. That's the way these platforms are designed. And that's how they respond to the fact that they're in competition with each other and they're each trying to maximize their own market share. This is something that we've done to ourselves. So yeah, that's where sense making comes in, I think.
Yeah, as Tristan Harris points to a lot, it's that one of the big cognitive dissonance of our time is that we think that social media is a tool that is given to us of kind of a divine right or something. Best case scenario, we are customers. But what he's trying to explain us is we're not customers, we are the product.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that? What does he mean by that?
Yeah, there's a saying, I don't know if he came up with it, but if you're not paying for a service, then you are not the customer, you are the product. And Facebook being a perfect example of that. Facebook has the most intense data on us and that we've given to it. We give it all of our data as we're clicking, as we're joining groups, as we're liking certain things, even what our mouse hovers over or where we slow down when we're scrolling. We're giving them all of this information and they're using it to sell things to us. And they're also using that data. So basically the data that we are providing to these big tech companies is the thing that they use to make their services more profitable. Like Google targeted ads, all of the things. So all of these services that we're not paying for are basically using our data against us effectively.
And the people who runs big tech and these companies, do they have our best interests in mind, or is it the bottom line, or is it something in between? What do you think?
They have, I mean, just the nature of the corporate operating system means that they don't really have a choice than to maximize market share and they're involved in a sort of a conflict with all the other social media companies, with all the other distractions, the information economy. It seems difficult to see how in a free market or capitalist economy you could have voluntary regulation of those kind of those tech platforms. Like the comparison that I like to make is with we need some kind of regulation, and a lot of people are kind of wrestling with what that might mean. And obviously it brings up a lot of people's immediate reactivity around, we need absolute free speech. And I think that's naive. I think like free speech absolutism is naive in this current world. But the comparison that I like to make is with the BBC in the UK. When television and radio were invented in the 1920s, the kind of the authorities or the establishment recognized that these were much more powerful mediums than what we had before, than just the printed word. And they regulated them in the UK. So we had the BBC that was created. We had, and it was I'd say it was a very far-sighted creation. I mean, there's all sorts of problems with the BBC that people can point to. There's certainly the same kind of lack of sort of diverse perspectives that you get in a lot of media organizations, but it's better than nothing. And what we do have in the UK is some sense of truth outside of just one side or the other. The BBC is trying to hold this center space. And what happened with the BBC was that they designed it, they built it in a way that would have arm's length from government. So it was funded by a compulsory tax. It was independent with its charter renewed every 10 years that gave it a certain distance from government, because they recognized that truth itself was a value that needed to be upheld, that it shouldn't be subject to direct government pressure. It should have a degree of independence, et cetera, et cetera. And this worked because then in the 1930s, those super powerful technologies of radio and television were used by the Nazis to create the Third Reich in Germany. Those technologies allowed for coordination, allowed for some kind of coordination of a culture in a society in a way that wouldn't have been possible before. So I think we're now in a new world where we have these new technologies that are arguably infinitely more powerful even than television and radio, and yet we have no way of regulating them. We have no way of even thinking about how it might be possible to regulate them. How would you even start that kind of process of recognition of, okay, there's something that needs to happen here? Who would be empowered to do that? How could you regulate some of the world's most powerful, not only the world's most powerful companies now, but probably some of the most powerful companies that have ever existed? What would that process look like? How could it happen? It's hard to kind of imagine right now what that might even look like.
Is it a danger that we fall into nihilism because everything seems so impossible to do something about?
Sure. I mean, nihilism is always a danger, and I think a lot of people probably have gone there. But I mean, there are a lot of people dealing with this or wrestling with this. I think all we can do is kind of explain or articulate our understanding of it. And particularly, I think, to shine a light on how unfettered free speech is not the full answer. It's part of the answer, or free speech is obviously part of the answer, but it's not the full answer. There's more to it than that. There are other incentive structures. There are other problems with the information ecology that are not solved by unfettered, more free speech.
Actually, that's also one of the concepts I really want to touch about, information ecology. I think it was also Schmachtenberger who had a parable about that people don't want to throw trash outside, or some people do. I mean, some corporations throw oil in the sea and because they want to make money, but most people don't throw trash out of the window of the car because it's obviously a bad thing to do. But when it comes to the information ecology, like for your Facebook feed or what you post online or whatever, it doesn't seem like we have the same degree of consciousness around what we're throwing literally out there. Can you elaborate a bit on that, on what he means about that, and what you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a good analogy. Like pollution in the information commons or the information ecology is something we don't usually think of, but if we start to think of what that means, and then if we can start to work towards, which is also what first attracted me to Jordan Peterson's message, is this real focus on truth and spoken truth, and saying only speak what you feel to be true, and to pay attention to your words, and to do that kind of individual work. Then you ask, what does that look like from a wider societal perspective? How many of the messages that we are getting on a regular basis are manipulative or untruthful or partial, and then you realize that's happening pretty much everywhere. There's whole industries that are based solely on that activity.
But truth has always been under attack, and sometimes I feel people in this discussion can be a bit nostalgic and look back to a time where the Enlightenment or whatever, when good ideas prevailed, and I think it's a bit naive, as you touched upon earlier. It's a lot of naivety going around. But one thing you touch upon a lot is like, it's not necessarily that the world is more polarized now, or the division between the teams are stronger or something like that, but it's exponential tech. That's the big problem. It's the incredible scope of the technological advancements we have had that has not been in conjuncture with kind of our cognitive or moral enhancement. Can you elaborate a bit on that, if you understood my question?
Yeah, I think you identified it correctly. Which is we've talked about the need for nuance, and I think that's part of the need for nuance is not to frame it as if this is a completely new problem, because it's not a completely new problem, but it is a problem in a different register than it was. And exponential tech is making it exponentially more problematic, in the same way that exponential tech means that we can, if you compare a stick or a gun to a nuclear weapon, like there are different levels of the invention of the nuclear weapon didn't mean that suddenly that we were suddenly violent, and before that we weren't violent, and it meant that things had got to the point where we could actually wipe out the entire human race if we carried on doing things as we had been doing before. And I think we're getting to that stage with the weapons of sense making. And another point that Jordan Hall made was that if, in a way, the nuclear weapon of sense-making would be more dangerous than the other nuclear weapon, because at least you can see the other nuclear weapon and you kind of know what it does by its very nature. If the most effective sense-making weapons are not visible, they're what happened to us, or the point is that we're not aware that our sense-making is being warped. And I think we're seeing, like, I look at Facebook, I look at people that I thought were kind of probably a little bit anti-establishment, but generally kind of mostly sane in 2016. And I look at them now and I look at what they're posting, and I think this has got, like, the trajectory has got a lot worse. Like, the way that sort of really unconvincing conspiracy narratives are taking hold in so many different areas, where you just see some people going from, like, I can understand some people thinking that Trump is a necessary evil in some ways, that they're more worried about the potential of the radical left, or they think that Trump has been overly criticized by the media, and I can get on board with that. But then to go from that to saying, well, and Trump is actually some kind of a hero, Trump is a hero, Trump is, every bad thing about Trump is created by the mainstream media. It's like, that's insane. Like, how could you not see quite clearly who he is, like what kind of person he is? He's obviously a massive narcissist. He's obviously a very, he's obviously a pretty awful person. To see that,
it sounds people, a bit like. Sorry.
No, I'm just summarizing. Yeah, I've seen an incredible. I think many people might have seen the same thing. Like the fragmentation and the quite honestly just delusion that I've seen grow over the last years has been quite extraordinary.
It sounds a bit like the inverse logic of, since Hitler was a vegetarian, it must be bad to only eat vegetables or something like that. Since the coverage of Trump is stupid, and I saw just recently a Norwegian newspaper made a big fuss about Rudy Giuliani sweating a lot, and they had some misspellings in one of the court cases about election fraud and stuff. And since this is obviously very, very stupid coverage, doesn't mean that Trump is a good guy, but some people tend to make that cognitive jump that since the people are covering Trump is disingenuous somewhat, he maybe must be genuine. Yeah, and that sounds like a very flawed logic.
The other day, if you accept everything that the mainstream tells you, then you're very naive. But if you reject everything that the mainstream says, then that leads to madness.
And this leads us into another concept that you have been talking a lot about, and that is the weaponizing of ideas. It's a very difficult word to translate into Norwegian. I try, but I cannot do it. But since we're speaking English anyway, you can explain what it means in English.
The weaponization of ideas.
Yeah.
It's where ideas become quite partial, and that there's often a higher synthesis, or there's often a potential synthesis that we're not even looking for when we're in one particular mode. And it's something that Jonathan Haidt talks about a lot. It's all that a lot of our perspectives on the world are temperamentally based. And it's actually quite an evolutionary characteristic that we're temperamentally based. So there's a kind of weaponization of certain concepts on the left and certain concepts on the right. Like, we assume that the left owns kind of empathy or owns openness, or the right owns loyalty or family or any of these kind of concepts. And that's where things often become weaponized. And what's been extraordinary is how even something like the global pandemic, certainly in America and maybe increasingly elsewhere, but America, it became a party political issue almost immediately. And the nature of like wearing masks or not, or and possibly we'll see. I mean, there might even be a big concern with the vaccine now. Like all of these things that should not be, all of these topics that are of huge importance to like public health and to safety and to the functioning of society, all of these things have been weaponized. And like really, really important life and death issues and life and death subjects have been weaponized by one side or the other. And that's something that, it's a process that seems far more developed in the US than anywhere else. But I think it's also, you can see it in many other places as well.
It seems like it's an extreme variant of the guilt by association logic. Like if you sit down and talk to some guy who propagated some Holocaust denial ideas or something, you may be what you call cancel, or at least people are getting suspicious about you. But now it's almost like it's guilt by association of ideas. If you're talking about you should wear a mask, for some people you're suddenly Antifa or something, you're on the extreme left. Or if you're critical of the lockdowns, you're a Trump supporter. How did we end up here where obviously very important questions that have nothing to do with politics, but as you said, has something to do with medicine and life and death, has become right-wing, left-wing polarized questions?
Yeah. And also this sense that if you know someone's opinion on one thing, you can probably work out their opinion on everything else. And that's a pretty terrifying thought. But if you have a classically left-wing view on one thing, that all the way down the line, and that the mask wearing being a really interesting one, because traditionally conservatives are more worried about disease than liberals. This is actually not what you would expect, that you would have a strong anti-mask thing coming from the right, but which shows that it's not necessarily temperamentally based. It actually sort of becomes a tribal signifier. And I think it became a tribal signifier because people on the right felt that they recognized that this was a danger to Trump. So they wanted to kind of play it down. They wanted to believe that it wasn't all that important. And that is why, and I think that's where the weaponization often comes from someone either subconsciously or consciously playing through in their head and thinking, does this benefit my side or does it benefit the other side? And if it doesn't benefit my side or it benefits the other side, they then take a view based on that rather than a full kind of investigation or appreciation of the situation or the concept.
So my team winning seems more important than the world progressing in a better direction.
Yes.
Is that the right assessment?
Yeah, I think that's what I would...
How do you...
Motivated reasoning, yeah.
How do you see this progress in the years to come? Is it going to get worse, or are we closing into a kind of a reaction against it? Is it going to get worse before it gets better?
I think so. I don't see how it's not going to, because I think all of the same factors that created it are still there. I feel like, in some sense, the heat might be turned down by Trump losing. I think Trump was just such an incredibly polarizing figure that no matter whether you sort of supported him or not, for me, I don't know how it won't turn down the volume in some way. Like everything won't suddenly be seen through the lens of Trump, which it has been over the last 4 years. And a lot of the people that I was speaking to were thinking that there was a fair chance that there might be actual sort of civil war, that the election, that things had got so heated that civil war might be possible, which, to be honest, hasn't gone away completely, because we don't know what Trump is going to do after he leaves. We know that he will probably never really accept the election result. But I hope that the volume might go down and we might start to see some progress. But I also feel like it's not, my sense is that it's not going to, we're never going to go back to normal, let's put it that way.
What is normal anyway? But of course, it's obvious that he's a divisive figure and that some of his, or most of his claims are outrageous. But on the other side, it's pretty unprecedented that some of the steps Twitter are taking to, if not censor what he's writing, at least try to put a halt in it. Or what do you think about? What do you think about the way Twitter handled the whole Trump era? Do you think it's a warranted reaction, or do you think it's a slippery slope?
I think all of the tech platforms are wrestling with what they've created, and one of the ways of doing that is to, like, recently to have brought in these sort of warning, this is not, these fact-checking devices. I don't see that they have much choice, but I don't think it's a long-term solution to the problem. I don't know what the long-term solution to the problem is, but you could argue that certainly Facebook has done an awful lot to radicalize an awful lot of people. Like, they've basically been sort of recommending more and more radical groups for people to join, more and more radical perspectives for people to kind of get on board with. And that's not been a positive thing. So I don't know. I mean, they're doing it sort of too little too late. And I don't think anyone really trusts them to do it. I don't think anyone really trusts their motives or trusts. I think they're doing it because they're being sort of forced to. So I don't know. I mean, I give them some credit for it, but it's also possibly too little too late.
Yeah, but it seems like we come to a place where it's possible for two narratives to exist at the same time, like geographically at least, possibly just 100 meters of each other. Like one Facebook feed in my room and my next door neighbor have another Facebook feed, which in one of the narratives, it's like social media is propagating right-wing extreme ideas and they have to clamp down on that. And in my Facebook feed or whoever else 100 meters away from that, it's Silicon Valley is run by a left-wing agenda, and they're totally Google is totally biased towards Biden or whatever. How is it possible that two so opposing narratives can exist together at the same time?
Because that's the world we live in. Like, that's profitable for these companies to have these reality tunnels, these filter bubbles, and that's what. I mean, we've created it through the tools in some way, or let's put it this way: it's preyed on very human biases.
And in the last sense-making video, which came up about a month ago or something, for the first time you started talking about solutions, a way out of this. Are you optimistic? And what do you see as part of the solutions, or what necessitates getting out of this dark hole?
I mean, the solution in that video was a project that Daniel Schmachtenberger is working on called the Consilience Project, which is about how to start healing the information ecology. And I mean, he is one of the most interesting thinkers that I'm aware of in this space. So I have some hope that it might do some good. I'm an advisor on the project. I have to say I'm not massively hopeful, because I don't see. I see how resistant and how powerful the argument is against any kind of either regulation or some way of dealing with the problem. And I think that's going to be very hard to break through. I think it's, I think we're almost going to have to see some of the sort of worst consequences of this fracturing of reality play out before there's enough awareness and acceptance that something needs to be done. Like I think,
because it seems like almost like nuance is really disincentivized in this information ecology. It's like it doesn't pay off to be nuanced. You're losing money because people want to watch something more radical to one side or the other. You're losing time on site for your customer, your viewers not interested if you don't have a exceptional message. How can we incentivize more nuance in the information ecology? Do you think it's possible?
It's a good question. How do we incentivize more nuance? I guess all we can do is to try and build it into our output, what we're doing, and hope that it becomes, that people get bored with people start to see through the business model that leads to more extreme perspectives, and starts to see through it, start to kind of want to see some of those perspectives challenged, start to want to actually seek out challenging information and to go through a process of realizing that they were wrong, rather than just wanting to be kind of force-fed more of the stuff they always thought or they already believed. I guess we've got to look at how can we start to incentivize or start to build a cultural movement around developing our thinking, developing our sense-making. That's, I guess, the only thing. How do you make it cool how do you make nuance cool, I guess, is the question.
We had to get some hipsters on board to try to make a campaign.
I think a lot of the hipsters are. I think so. I think the hipsters, some of them are at least, but we need to make it even cooler.
But wouldn't you agree that it seems like the big corporations, like the sports footwear corporations and the telecom corporations, and everyone is jumping on the political bandwagon and trying to make money off of whatever message is cool right now, whether it's equity or the environment issues or gender equality? And what do you think about where the corporation has gone in this direction, if you agree?
I mean, what comes up when you say that is just this question whether it works for them. There's a kind of, you've heard the phrase "go woke, go broke." So there've been quite a few high-profile missteps by big companies, like the Gillette ad a year or two ago, which basically was sort of Gillette taking a stance against toxic masculinity, really did not do very well for that company at all. Like a lot of men really objected to the way that felt that they were being lectured to by a big corporate. It didn't do much for their share price or their bottom line. I wonder how useful. I wonder how much the sort of go woke, go broke thing is true. I don't actually know whether it often kind of backfires for corporates to be seen to be doing stuff that's sort of virtue signaling. I don't know, but I don't.
Yeah,
see, yeah.
Yeah, what I'm scared about is a typical example of many, and I think this has been even worse during Corona because so many people are sitting inside and need content all the time. A lot of commercials for telecom companies and Netflix streaming services and stuff like that. They're trying to package their product by saying, like, do you want to be equal, or do you want a fair world, a balanced world where everybody's on the same page, everybody's happy, everybody has as big a place as everyone else? You should sit down in front of the TV or use your phone to connect with other people all the time and look at more of this junk that we're pushing out there. I'm scared that this feedback loop can be very destructive, that young people especially, I start to think that the more I interact on my phone, the more I'm engaged in like a global community where we move progressively towards a better world, where everybody's linked up and everybody's equal. But in reality, they're just getting more and more, as you said, hijacked, or the limbic hijacked. Can you also see this, that this is a possible trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's getting, certainly for the younger generation who've grown up in this environment, I see it very, I don't know how you go through these, how you even form your personality if you're not able to, if you're worried about what you're going to say constantly, if you're worried about what you're going to be, if you say something wrong on social media, if you kind of go against any kind of orthodoxy on your views on things. Like, how do you develop your own ideas if you're not prepared to express yourself, and you're worried about expressing yourself? I think that's a huge problem. And I think that's something that we're seeing play out right now in, I mean, so many sort of issues with young people now. It's and also this, that there's a big, this is something that Jonathan Haidt talks about, that there was a big change in the kind of personalities of the younger generation from about 2013, 2014. And he basically says this is the sort of the first digital natives. They're much more cautious. They're much more insular. They're much more worried about saying the wrong thing. They're much more interested in policing each other's behavior. And he called it the coddling of the American mind. I mean, he basically said, look, this is really not good. It's really not good. And that's something I think we're going to see play out.
The three big untruths. I read the book. The always look at the world in good and evil. One of them, of course, and what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. How did the kids end up like this? Do you think? What did it start with? If you agree with Jonathan Haidt's concepts.
I've not read the whole book by Jonathan Haidt, but I would recommend anyone to have a look at it if they're interested. I mean, he talks about a sort of helicopter parenting, that there's a lot of single child families. There's a lot more invested in those kids than previously. They often don't have siblings. There's more of a sense of danger, so they're not playing outside as much. Like, all of these things make a difference. And then online becomes their real world as well. And the rules of online become their rules. And those are, that's not terribly healthy. They're not going out as much. There are lots of different factors combined. But I think the main thing is just how quick and how reactive conflict can become as well. Like, if someone pissed you off 20 years ago, you might get to say something to them when you saw them in a couple of weeks' time, when you probably calmed down. Whereas now, everyone's immediately available and you're having an argument with people on Facebook or whatever. It's kind of constant, and it's the environment that a lot of them kind of live in all the time.
A famous Norwegian anthropologist wrote the book some years ago and talked about that in the 90s, the age of thinking out loud died. And I think we can really see that now, that thinking out loud, which I see as a very positive thing, almost seems like a very dangerous thing, because what you could talk about self-policing and policing in your in-group.
Yes.
How can we start to think out loud again? Is it possible, do you think?
It's a very good question. I think it's right. I think thinking out loud has become a dangerous thing. I think it's something that is imperative, and that's partly what I was, when I was talking about the intellectual dark web, that's part of what I was focusing on, was that they were epitomizing a kind of thinking I think I called it thinking in public. They were prepared to talk about things that would get you cancelled if you said it in some environments, and that's what people were really wanting to see, and became a really interesting phenomenon. But it also didn't really go beyond that so much, which was where I was critical of it.
Can you also see a danger in the narrative that thinking in public or thinking out loud or even intellectual honesty becomes like a right-wing cause, that if they're not on
yes,
purpose
I mean, I think well, I think free speech a while ago became seen as a right-wing thing, and that's a very dangerous place to be.
It seems absurd that like the how you're thinking, like not what you're thinking, but the way you're thinking and epistemology and stuff like that become right-left issues. It seems like a very dangerous path down a dark hole.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the weaponization of ideas, and I think that's one of them. I think there is some truth to like free speech can be weaponized. I mean, it's this is where the nuance comes in, because it's very easy to say something like, well, free speech needs to be absolute. It's outrageous that the left is now trying to restrain free speech when the left used to be the ones who are calling for it. But at the same time, those arguments over, oh, you're just infringing my free speech, can be used by actual Nazis and people who you don't want to give a platform. It's like, oh, why aren't you giving me a platform? It's like, well, because we've agreed we don't want to hear those ideas. We don't want to hear those kind of ideas. And it can't be, yeah. And there also is a question of where someone is platformed. So it's difficult. It's a really difficult topic, and it's one that I think no one has solid answers to, or no one has a definitive answer that doesn't involve a lot of nuance and thinking out loud, basically.
And it's also very difficult because especially young people, but almost all people who are using media and living in this landscape nowadays, they don't have a lot of stamina when it comes to taking in content. Everything has to be very fast and very easily digested. Do you see a danger there also? Obviously.
Sure.
That can you liken the way we consume media and entertainment as the way we talked about, for instance, junk food 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, there's a junk food aspect to it. I'm going to have to go very soon.
Yeah.
I just wondered if there were any final questions you wanted to ask before we...
Final question, yeah. Other than watching Rebel Wisdom and your lots of good videos out there, what can we as individuals do? What can we, if you if you look at us as individuals, what can we do, each one of us, to health the information ecology and prevent narrative warfare?
I would probably say to pay attention to our own words and what we are, our own truthfulness. I think it has to start there. And I think that's why, or one of the reasons that Jordan Peterson became so popular when he did, was because he was speaking to that you need to say things that make you feel strong, not things that make you feel weak. And that's, yeah, I think that's the key. And to develop our own practice around that, to find other people who are also trying to make sense of the world and to form those kind of relationships. I think that's the really important thing.
And you also building a lot of real life networks around your channel. Can you just briefly talk a bit about them and how you can, people, for instance, in Norway can hook up with you guys or participate or engage in the stuff you're doing?
Yeah, we have a community. We have a Rebel Wisdom community of around 1,000 people who kind of found the channel, joined, and then we do dialogues, we do conversations with them. And that, yeah, that's part of what we're talking about. That's part of the community being the next line of development. And that's something that we're constantly experimenting with different ways of creating that and doing that.
rebelwisdom.co.uk.
That's right.
Pleasure to have you with us, David.
Yeah.
Good luck with all your projects.
Yeah, thank you, Sturla, and take care.